So you're always presented with the question of how do you manipulate your data in order to do reporting. All of your reporting tools have the ability to do some data blending, data corrections, and other types of processing of your data. Most of them are SQL based. Some of them have some ability within canned tools. Myself, I prefer to do as much work in Alteryx in order to prep my data for reporting, to keep my reporting focused on how I want to present the data, how we want people to slice and dice it, what kind of security I might want to put in place, things like that. In the perfect world of a data warehouse, the data warehouse team is building your reporting structures, possibly creating your data marts. But in the self-service world, data warehouse team is probably presenting you with some of the more raw data or just partially constructed data. And that's where Alteryx comes in, so that you can build some structures that are easier to report from. My cautionary tale is not to take the data all the way down and make it exactly what you want to report, make the reporting one-to-one, but simply build a data set that you can deal with multiple reporting requirements and getting it out of the same kind of data. Again, experience will show you the better ways of building these. But again, in self-service, go ahead and build a structure that makes your reporting easier using the plethora of tools that Alteryx provides you with that I believe are easier to use than most of the reporting tools. So we're going to go ahead and prep a couple of data sets to be used in reporting, and it's going to come out of the puppy sales work table. One of the easy ways to get this data in here is simply to drag our data file into our new workflow. Put a selector on the end of it. We're using the Alteryx database table format, so it remembers the data types that we were using last, so they look good and clean, what we want them to be. But there's a lot of data being missed when we go into the browse, the interactive tools that show you information. It's nice to be able to present that in a tabular format, so you can take a quick look at what your data is going to be. You can look through this data and say, oh, this looks like this looks like that. But actually having some kind of reporting metrics associated with the data within this table is very helpful to us. And what you'll see is Alteryx goes ahead and gives us the ability to do this as well. So what we want to do is come into the data investigation. There's a couple of things on here. One of my favorites is the basic data profile. When we run the basic data profile against our data set, you'll see that what's returned to us, there we go, is different metrics associated with each of the fields in your data stream. It has the field name, the metric name, and then the value associated with it. And this becomes useful for us to be able to do some kind of reporting from a spreadsheet format, take a look at the data when it comes in from a report to be generated automatically to go as part of your ETL process. This format is all not that useful because it is tabular with each field name having a value and multiple records associated. We like to clean this up into a matrix, and we can do that with the Alteryx tools, so we can take a look at what's going on here. As you can see, there's a number of fields in here, some which are more useful to us than others. We want to right size this data by putting a selector on the end of it. So as we have our VW strings, very expensive way of using it, so let's turn these down to something smaller. Make this a V string, so 100. The name is the name of the attribute. They are a bit smaller. And then we have the value field. You'll notice that some of these fields are a bit long, but we're not going to be using those, so we're not going to make it as long as it's necessary. And we'll go ahead and make these at 100 as well. Now when we run this, our data will look a little bit neater, but you notice that we have some truncated because one of the values in here happens to be all of the values associated with that attribute. Very long string, useful if you're going to be doing something with this, but not for our data profile. We're not too concerned about the actual values that exist within this flow, but just some of the overall metrics. So what we want to do is there's just some of these fields that we want to move forward, not all of them. So I created a filter when I was working on this before. I'll cut and paste that into it. This is a custom filter. If we created one, we basically are creating a where clause. So a couple of columns begin with the word null. And then there's a unique data type and size are the ones I want to see. There's a number of ways I could accomplish this. I could do this through a join, but I found the filter was a pretty simple way because I didn't need that much data. Something that is missing from this list, if you come into here, it doesn't actually have a record count. It tells me how many nulls, how many not nulls. I can calculate the record count if I wanted it to. But it'd be nice simply to get a count of records. Well, it turns out we're getting ready to go into transform anyway. There is a count records widget. It simply counts the records in there, no configuration required. Again, in setting the data types, let's go ahead and put a select here. Because the output is an integer 64, we don't need anything quite that big. Again, that's just a small change. So now when we run this, we actually just have a column that is strictly the count of the records that are in there. Also, it would be nice to give it a little bit better name, and we can do that within the select as well. So go ahead and just call this record count. So let's start to put this data set together just to do our matrix profile. So what I want to do now is turn these rows into columns where the name of the metric becomes the name of the column. We'll use the crosstab. Previously we used the transpose. The crosstab is the opposite of the transpose. It takes rows and turns them into columns. Again, this icon is what I use to base what I'm going. They are associated with also with tab and with pivot and unpivot. I can never remember which is which. Comment here says that the cross tab is equal to a pivot. But again, you go by the icon. What I want to do here is to go ahead and group the data by field name. This means that I'll get one record for each field. That will then have the multiple columns. The column header becomes the name, and the new value becomes obviously value. So that means that I'll have a column called data type, and a value for that will be integer 32. This is an aggregate function, which means that it will if you have two rows with the same name, it will try to put them together. So we need to tell it how to aggregate those. In this case, even though we know there's only one, we just want to go ahead and choose the first value so that keeps this processing clean. Now when I run it, get the same errors we had before, warnings actually, that's okay. So now we see we have a nice little matrix. It has the field name, the data type, the non-nulls, the null, size, and uniques. We want to join this data with our row counts. And we'll do that with the append field. That simply does the product join. And we'll bring this row count, since there's only one to each column, each record as a new column. So this finishes giving me the set of data that I want to use. What I want to do next is, after selecting the right amount of data, I want to use a filter to do some calculations. To save a little bit of time in this process, I will go ahead and copy and paste them in from my finished workflow that I'm working off of. So here I want to give it a little bit nicer standard names for not nulls and data type. And then do calculations where I calculate the percent null, which is simply a basic percentage calculation, and the percent not null, companion to that. Put a browse on the end of this so that I can see it. Now when I run this, I get out of it a very nice data profiling matrix. So I can see something about the data. I can see how many nulls are in there. For example, birth date, we have our value for each one, but the adoption period, we do have some null values in there, which is what we expected because we had the companion between these, which is the sales. So you either adopted or you were actually sold with a sales amount. It just shows me the data type so I can have an idea of what's going on. Percentage nulls tells me how complete the data is. So I can look at this now and see a little bit more about the information as I go into building my report tables. Now I don't want this to run every single time. I tend to want to run this once as I'm playing with the data. But I don't want to lose this or put it in a separate workflow because it's sort of part of the process of doing this work. Alteryx has a tool to help me with that. It's actually in documentation because it was originally, I think, designed to be a documentation widget, but it's called a tool container. What the container does is allows you to document a set of widgets by giving them a name and a comment. And what I want to do is go ahead and drag the tools that are part of this documentation container into it, highlighting all of them, dragging it down. Sometimes you have to be careful how to drop this, but if you notice that the container outline goes to light blue when it's ready to drop it in. Black means nothing's going in. Blue means it's going in. I now have a container that contains that set of widgets. Nice documentation. I can give it a name. There we go. That tells me what's in it. Data profile. Stream. A couple other nice things I can do with this is if I want to save space, I can minimize it. So I don't actually see the widgets that are there. They're simply existing in here. As well as if I don't actually want to run this stream, I can turn it off. So now it will not execute this set of widgets when I'm working on the rest of my data. I can minimize it to get it out of my way, and I can go on with actually building my data. So let's look at what we want to do. We want to generate two reporting data sets. We want to go ahead and separate this data into the two pieces that it is. One piece of this is the sales, and the second piece is the adoption. So obviously we will want to go ahead and split this with a filter. In order to keep this a little bit shorter, we're going to go ahead and copy in some widgets that we've worked with before, talk about them simply, but not actually have to worry about building them. Copy and paste. Drop it over here. Connect it up. Line it up, make it look neat. So I want to select off the fields that I need. They're actually going to start out by using all of them because my processing will limit this. First thing I want to do is I need to create some information. I want to create a kennel name. Remember, we had some null kennel names in there. And so in this data set, the null kennel name means it's actually Daisy Hill. because it comes out of a different system and it doesn't identify who we are. So we go ahead and if the kennel name is null, we set it Daisy Hill. If it's not null, we keep its current kennel name. We need the sales year month. This is a great way of getting a piece of data that is the year and month associated right with the date. So I use the date time. This extracts the numeric month. This extracts the numeric year, and then using that will get me a year and month. To do some reporting, I want to be able to report by day of the month to show the growth over the course of just simply a month and compare them month over month. So I also want to choose the day. So I do a date time day, and that pulls the numeric day out of the date. And then in order to summarize records, I need something to sum up. And I found it a good idea as you're reporting a data set, you go ahead and include a 1 as a record count in each of the records. So that gives you the ability to summarize, to sum up the counts to see how many records fit within a category that you're at. Let's go ahead and run this. We can look at the data coming out and see that now what we have at the end of that is the sales year month, the sales day of month, as well as the one that allows me to do some counting of records. So the filter is obviously that if the sales amount is null, then it was an adoption. And so the top half is going to be the sales reports because I have the is not null in here. And the bottom of this is going to be the adoption report. What we're going to want to calculate is running totals. Salesmen like to see running totals throughout the course of the month so that they can see how quickly they're achieving their goals, see whether or not they slack off at the end of the month or whether they increase at the end of the month. Useful information for sales managers and salesmen themselves to see how they're doing. And so we're going to want to go ahead and do running counts. And to get that running count to work properly, we want to make sure we have the data in the right order. So we want to go ahead and use our sort to get the data properly aligned so that we can do that running totals. Let's choose year, month, and then day of the month. Data is lined up that way, then we'll be able to get proper running totals. Take a quick execution of this, and you can see that our data coming out here is in month order and then in day order. We do have gaps in there because you don't sell a puppy every day of the month. Salesforces, again, really do like these running totals. It turns out that Alteryx has a running total widget, so you don't have to figure out how to do this. You can do it for the multi-row formula and some other methodology, but the fact that there is a widget here that does it for you automatically is just completely wonderful. So what we need to do is configure this. We want to group the data. It's, in other words, start the count at the beginning of each month. And our running total is going to be on the sales amount. When we run this, then it'll show us the actual total as it runs through the month. So we start out with the first sale gives us 192. We add a second sale of 96. And that gives us a 289 for the running total for that sales amount for the month. We also want to count the number of sales alongside of that. We'll do that with another running total. Basically, it's going to be formatted the same way as the first one, which is the sales year month. And now to count them, it makes it easier because we have this record count, which is just a 1. That's why we created that. It makes it easier to count things. Running this as well, you see that we're not really busy from a sales standpoint here at Daisy Hill. So you can see that our running total goes up. If you scan down here, there is one place where we actually skipped by 2 because we did have some sales that were 2 within the same day. To clean up this data a little bit further, we'll put our select on the end of it. We don't need all these records for our reporting. We want to keep the sales year, the sales month. We do not need the actual sales date. We do not need the record count or the sale amount. What we want to get in here then, double is way too big. Also want to switch these in direction. I want to see the count first. Let's make this an integer of 32, just to right size the data. Also, if we go into a database, it would be nice to have the actual amount. We can go ahead and give this a meaningful name to us. Let's call that the sales count running total. And this is the sales amount. Running total. And then since it's a dollar, let's give it a dollar format, a fixed decimal. 10 with 2 decimal places. And when I run this originally, I will go ahead and simply save this as another YXDB file with my output data. Drop on the end of it. Again, you need to get very comfortable with this. YXDB, let's call this. Simply giving it a name. We run this, and we see we have something that's going to be pretty easy for us to generate a month-over-month sales report. We have the sales year month, the sales day of month, the running count of sales, and then the total. Pretty straightforward. Second part of this is to do something with the adoption report as well. Here we want something different. We just want to do some summarization. To go ahead and create the number of puppies that are waiting adoption for each day. So we want to know what our overhead liability is associated with the adoption, since there is an adoption grace period. We want to know how many puppies are simply every day are out there waiting for final adoption. So we need that liability. If they may come back at any time. Help us with capacity planning as far as the overall kennels are concerned, as well as our training programs. So what we want to do here, first of all, is to only look at those puppies that are awaiting their final adoption. Because some puppies are immediately adopted, do not have a grace period. In our preparation, we have our filter. We get just that piece of data we want to be reporting off of. And if the adoption period is greater than 0, that means this puppy is waiting to be adopted. So on the true side, you can see that now it's just all the puppies that are waiting. Not very many of them, by the way. We don't adopt very many, it looks like. It's 45 waiting to be adopted. And there happen to be 34 that were immediately adopted. But again, just to get an idea of how we can do this reporting, in order to count the number of puppies that are on site by day, it's very difficult from a SQL query standpoint. It's also something very difficult to do in your reporting tools, because to determine if a puppy is there for any specific day requires a ranged query. But in order to do the calculations, you've got to execute many range queries. You don't want to have to bleed out that data within your reporting tool. Alteryx has the ability to actually allow us to create a record for each day that the puppy is awaiting adoption. But to know that, the first thing we need to do is do a quick calculation to get us that final date. Because what we have is the day that they were initially adopted. We have the grace period, but we don't have that final date, so we don't really know that range that the puppy is out there. So all we want to do here is do a date time add of the adoption begin and give it the adoption period in days. Date time add is another one of those functions you'll be using quite often in reporting. It's nice that Alteryx has it to work so conveniently. So we can see that if the adoption began on 1/27 with an adoption period of 60 days, the final date for that puppy to be returned is the 2021 March 28th. So now that we know that, what we want to do is go ahead and create a record so that between these dates we will have records. So there needs to be 60 records for this puppy that shows that these are the 60 days that's going to be awaited being adopted. And Alteryx has that right here with the generate rows. Anytime you're doing any type of range calculations where you want to get totals of things, such as patients staying at a hospital, computers waiting to be repaired, etc. It's nice to have the actual record sitting there waiting in a table for you to use to do your summarization and reporting off of. And that's where this tool comes in very handy. Let's drag our generate rows over it. We're going to build that. You notice that on the input connector, it's gray, which means that you can start out generating data just if you want to generate data to begin with. This is sometimes useful when you're trying to retrieve a data set and you want to join it up with a set of dates. You can always create a record for each of those dates to do your join with. But in this case, we do have data we want to start with, so we'll go ahead and drag that in and connect it. And it brings us up to this widget, which takes some explaining to do, which is the point of this part of the video. So what we want to do is create one record for each day that the puppy is waiting to be adopted. So depending upon how you want to define that, the first day that the puppy is in the adoption phase, it's not actually waiting to be adopted because it's gone out, and the last day is not actually waiting as well. So rather than 60 records, we just really want to have 59 records. So to do that, we need to determine creating a loop structure. And to do that, we always need to talk about what the initial value be associated with this structure, and then knowing when to stop looping through the structure. So the first value you want to give it is the day after adoption, or the day after the adoption process started. So our initialization, we can just type in the expression here, which is pretty difficult to do sometimes. You get used to it. Alteryx, one of the things I don't like about the way Alteryx works is that there are 3 different presentations of the ability to create formulas. You notice in the formula is a little bit more friendly to use. This one is partially friendly, but it takes a little bit different mechanics to get it done. Again, what we want to use is date time add as our function, so we click on the functions tab up here. It won't help us find it as it did in the formulas. It's always a good idea to try out some of these as a formula before you go ahead and put it in here. But if we get date time add, it needs to know the date. Well, that's in variables. So existing fields, we want to go use the adoption begin date, and we want to add 1 day to it. Day or days, it takes both of them, by the way, in case you're wondering. So we want to add 1 day to that. That'll be the first record that we create, is the day after the adoption at the kennel. We click OK. It'll validate that that formula is correct and then place it in here. when do we want to stop looping it? Well, before we do that, I always like to do this in a different order than this screen presents. I don't know why this piece of it is so large, but this is the first value. We want to look at how we then increment each value coming along. In other words, what do we do when we come to the second record in order to increment the value that we're assigning? Oh, I forgot up here we need to actually change this as well. So many things on the screen. We're going to create a new field called pending adoption date. And it happens to be a date. Now part of the discussion probably makes more sense, but that's okay. So what do we want to do with the second one? What date do we want to give it? Well, we want to add 1 to the previous date that we had already assigned. Let's go ahead and delete the default one. So what we want to do here is that as we increment ourselves through these, we want to add 1 more to the previous date that was created. Again, going functions date time add alphabetically comes out at the top, which is great. The variable that we want to use is that new one that we created. So down here we have the new field. I just scrolled down, by the way. So there's my pending adoption date, and we want to add 1 day to that as well. Just to show you the days and days works equally well, we'll put days in here rather than day. What this now tells us that the first record gets the 1 day after the adoption begin date, and then as we continue to loop through this process, we continue to increment the pending adoption date by 1. Question is, when do we want to stop? Well, we want to stop when, or after. Always say it as when we want to stop. We want to stop when it becomes greater than or equal to the adoption final date, which means we want to continue to loop as long as the pending adoption date is less than the adoption final date. That's by my choice. You could always say that you want to do it less than or equal to. In my case, my definition of pending adoption is as long as the pending adoption date is less than the adoption final date, we want to continue to create a record that that puppy is out there waiting to come back to us. We do that again through in here. But it is a Boolean expression rather than an actual calculation. So we want to know that the new field, pending adoption date, as long as it is less than the adoption final date, we want to continue to add records. This all makes a little bit more sense when you actually see the data. I recommend you try this on your own with some smaller data sets and see how you work this looping process. Now when we run this, we get no errors. We look at the output and we can see that this puppy was an adoption period of 60 days. It began on the 27th of January and ended on the 28th of March. And then we have a record for each of those days, starting the day after, all the way up into the final adoption date, which is here. Day before the final date, actually. So we have 59 records. So for this report, we want to go ahead and count the number of puppies that are pending adoption for each day. We will do that with a summarization, and we want to break that down by kennel. So we want to go ahead and group by our kennel name. We want to group by our pending adoption date. And then what we want to do simply is to count the number of puppies. We can do that by coming into our record count and doing a sum. And this will be the pending adoption count. We'll drop a select on the end here just to clean up the data coming out. V string's good, the date's good. Let's go ahead and choose this integer 32. We can run this and look at this. Clicked on the wrong icon. So now we can see pretty much we only have a few that are pending adoption on any day. Colorado puppy seems to be the most days we have one, some days we have two. It's a very terse set of data. Going back to our data testing, we might want to make a little bit larger data set for adoptions, but that's okay. This will give us the flavor of the report. Finally, what we want to do is go ahead and save this data so that our report can be generated from our reporting tool, which will be our next video. I'll be reporting it through Alteryx because Alteryx has a number of basic reporting tools available to you, so you just get an idea of what your data looks like before you jump into that giant effort to make a dashboard. Saving this out as a file. You'll notice one thing we can look at in here just very basically, if you're using Tableau, you see that you can actually do a Tableau data extract to make it very easy and very efficient for Tableau to read this data for you. But again, if you're doing a lot of reporting, it's nice to have a database sitting behind it. In my own case, what I would do with this data set is put it up into my SQL database and then use Tableau to pull the data out. But for now, let's just save this locally. We can run this. We now can look here and see that we have two data sets. We can click on that. It'll bring up the Alteryx version of looking at this data. So it's not just invisible to you. You can scan what that file looks like. And so now we have two sets of data that we can generate reports off of. And that will be the focus of the next workflow in this series.